Hello, viewers, and welcome back to Bring the Fact. This time, we will uncover the hidden side of a major event that has become the focus of public attention. What began as outrage over lawmakers' lavish allowances has escalated into a nationwide storm of protests. From the tragic death of a young ride-hailing driver struck by a police vehicle to the burning of government buildings across Indonesian cities, the nation now stands at a critical crossroads. How did one incident ignite such a wave of anger? And what truths lie beneath the flames of these demonstrations? Stay with us as we reveal the facts that many have tried to hide. But before we go any further, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. That way, you won't miss the hidden facts we will continue to uncover next. The spark that ignited Indonesia's biggest wave of unrest in decades came not from a sudden act of violence, but from the revelation of an extraordinary privilege. When news surfaced that members of the House of Representatives were receiving housing allowances of nearly 50 million rupiah each month, the contrast with the daily struggles of ordinary citizens struck a raw nerve. To many Indonesians, this was not merely about money. It was a symbol of how wide the gap had grown between the political elite and the people they claimed to represent. For workers battling inflation, students burdened by rising costs, and families struggling to buy basic necessities, the revelation confirmed what many already felt in their hearts, that those in power were living in a different world. What began as murmurs on social media soon transformed into waves of demonstrations. Labor unions, student groups, and civil society organizations poured onto the streets of Jakarta, their chants echoing between government buildings. Placards were raised high, demanding transparency, accountability, and the immediate revocation of what they saw as an insult to the suffering of the people. The atmosphere was tense, but still contained within the boundaries of lawful protest. Yet underneath, there was an energy that felt combustible, a sense that the country was standing at the edge of something larger. International media began to take notice. Reuters described the unfolding protests as the most significant challenge to Indonesia's political stability in years. The Associated Press highlighted the anger spreading across provinces, noting the demonstrations had been reported in more than 30 of the nation's 38 provinces. The Washington Post ran images of Jakarta's streets filled with thousands of people dressed in black, holding banners that denounced corruption and elitism. Outside observers were quick to draw comparisons with earlier chapters of Indonesia's history, when anger at inequality had pushed the nation into dramatic political shifts. Inside Indonesia, however, the movement was not simply about numbers or statistics, it was about dignity. A factory worker in Bekasi told reporters that he had never once been late in paying his rent. Yet lawmakers were paid an allowance larger than his entire yearly salary just for the option of housing. A university student in Yogyakarta said she was tired of lectures being cut short because professors were too exhausted from holding extra jobs, while politicians debated how much they should receive for representation costs. In Makassar, a group of mothers marched carrying empty rice bowls as a reminder of the kitchens they struggled to fill every day. The government initially sought to calm the situation. Statements were issued promising that the allowance system would be reviewed, but the language was cautious, almost bureaucratic, and did little to ease public outrage. In some cases, it only fueled suspicion that officials were more concerned about preserving their own benefits than addressing the roots of the crisis. By the final week of August, the capital was gripped by daily marches. Each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets filled again with protesters carrying torches, their chants rising louder against the concrete walls of power. The unrest was no longer confined to Jakarta. In Surabaya, Bandung, Medan, and Palembang, local crowds organized their own marches in solidarity. Videos of these gatherings, often streamed live, traveled quickly across the internet. TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram became digital battlefields where anger and frustration spread faster than officials could respond. By the end of the month, it was clear to both the government and the international community that Indonesia was entering a moment of historic volatility. What had started with outrage over parliamentary perks was evolving into a broader struggle about the meaning of fairness, the legitimacy of authority, and the direction of a nation standing at a crossroads. The protests outside the parliament had already shaken the nation, but it was one single moment of tragedy that transformed anger into uncontrollable fury. On the morning of August 28th, as thousands gathered around the gates of the National Assembly in Jakarta, tensions between demonstrators and police units escalated sharply. Among the crowd was a young driver for an online motorcycle taxi service, 21-year-old Afan Kurniawan. He had joined not as a student or a union member, but as an ordinary citizen who wanted his voice to be heard. Eyewitnesses recalled the atmosphere was already volatile. Rows of riot police stood with shields raised, and behind them, armored vehicles waited with engines running. Protesters chanted, waving flags and banners. Suddenly, in a moment captured on several phone cameras, one of the police vehicles moved forward at speed. In the chaos that followed, Afan was struck. At first, the vehicle appeared to stop, but then, shockingly, it continued moving, its heavy wheels rolling over his body. Screams erupted from the crowd as people rushed to help, while officers shouted for order. Afan was rushed to the nearest hospital, but within hours he was pronounced dead. His death spread like wildfire across social media. The image of his battered motorcycle lying in the street, combined with the footage of the vehicle pressing forward, ignited a national outrage. The hashtag that soon trended across platforms carried a brutal message. Police were no longer seen as protectors, but as aggressors who had spilled the blood of the people. The following day, thousands accompanied Afan's body to his burial. His green jacket, the symbol of his profession as a ride-hailing driver, was carried high above the crowd as a sign of mourning and defiance. Mourners cried, prayed, and shouted slogans demanding justice. When a local official tried to speak at the funeral, anger boiled over. Stones were thrown, shouts echoed, and the official had to retreat under guard. The funeral had become another protest, one that symbolized the depth of public pain. In Jakarta, demonstrations intensified. Protesters hurled bottles and stones at lines of riot police. Fires were set in the streets near the parliamentary complex. In Makassar, the crowd stormed the local legislative building, setting parts of it ablaze. In Surabaya, the office of the governor was attacked, windows shattered by angry hands. Across the archipelago, the same story repeated itself. Outrage at a death that should never have happened, transformed into collective acts of defiance. International outlets highlighted the tragedy as the turning point. Reuters described it as the spark that turned protests into riots. The Guardian reported that the death of a simple motorcycle driver had united diverse groups in grief and anger. For many Indonesians, Afan became a symbol of ordinary citizens crushed under the weight of arrogance and power. His story was no longer about one life lost, but about a nation demanding that no more lives should be taken so carelessly. The death of Afan Kurniawan did not just ignite anger in Jakarta. It sent a shockwave that traveled through the islands of Indonesia, transforming local frustrations into nationwide fury. By the end of August, protests that began as peaceful marches had erupted into some of the most violent clashes the country had seen in decades. Each city carried its own story, but all shared the same theme: grief turning into rage, and rage into destruction. In Makassar, the movement took its most tragic turn. Protesters surrounded the regional parliament building, chanting for justice and waving placards with Afan's name. As the hours passed, tensions exploded. Flames engulfed the building after Molotov cocktails were thrown through broken windows. The fire spread rapidly, consuming offices, archives, and assembly halls. Trapped inside were several staff members. By the time the blaze was contained, 3 lives had been lost. Images of the charred structure circulated across media outlets, becoming a symbol of how far the protests had escalated. Surabaya saw its own night of chaos. Crowds gathered around Grahadi, the governor's office, a colonial-era building that for decades had symbolized authority. Demonstrators broke through the gates, shattering glass and overturning furniture. Smoke rose into the night sky as parts of the building were set alight. Tear gas was fired by police, while young men and women responded with stones and debris pulled from the streets. The heart of East Java had become a battlefield. Elsewhere, the story was similar. In Mataram, mobs attacked government offices and forced employees to flee. In Solo and Yogyakarta, student-led marches turned violent after security forces attempted to disperse them with water cannons. In Cirebon, Banyumas, and Pekalongan, local legislative councils were besieged, their walls spray-painted with slogans condemning corruption and arrogance. Indonesia's vast geography, usually a barrier to unity, now served as a conduit for collective rage. The toll mounted quickly. By early September, at least 7 people were reported dead nationwide, hundreds injured, and more than 400 arrested. Property damage was estimated in the millions of dollars, with government facilities, vehicles, and public infrastructure left in ruins. Ordinary citizens suffered as well. Small shops burned in the crossfire, traffic collapsed in major cities, and hospitals filled with the wounded. President Prabowo Subianto, faced with the gravest domestic crisis of his administration, canceled a scheduled diplomatic trip to China. He appeared on national television promising a transparent investigation into Afan's death and announcing a reduction in the controversial parliamentary allowances. At the same time, he authorized a massive security response. Soldiers were deployed alongside police. Snipers were stationed on rooftops, and curfews were declared in several cities. The dual message was clear, an attempt at appeasement paired with a warning of force. International organizations responded with concern. The United Nations called for an independent probe into allegations of excessive violence by security forces. Human rights groups documented cases of missing persons and reported that protesters had been beaten during mass arrests. Several foreign governments issued travel advisories, urging their citizens to avoid Indonesia until the situation stabilized. Digital platforms, too, were drawn into the storm. Videos of police clashes, fires, and speeches by protesters flooded TikTok, Instagram, and X. In a rare move, TikTok suspended its live streaming feature across Indonesia, citing the danger of viral misinformation escalating the crisis. Yet the move was seen by many Indonesians as another attempt to silence their voices. What began as outrage over an allowance had evolved into a full-scale test of democracy. For a nation that had endured authoritarian rule in the past, the sight of armored vehicles on city streets and citizens chanting beneath clouds of tear gas felt like echoes of an older, darker time. But in the faces of the protesters, in the cries for justice shouted through smoke and fire, there was also a reminder that Indonesia's people were still determined to make themselves heard, no matter the cost. The wave of protests that swept across Indonesia revealed more than just public outrage at political privilege. It exposed deep cracks in trust, the fragility of institutions, and the voice of ordinary citizens who refused to be ignored. From the streets of Jakarta to the burning buildings in Makassar and Surabaya, every moment carried a message that could not be silenced. The world has now seen how one tragedy can spark a movement, and how that movement can reshape the story of a nation. That concludes the series of facts we have uncovered today. Do not forget to subscribe to the Bring the Fact channel and activate the notification bell so you will not miss the revelation of other important facts. Bring the Fact, uncovering the truth behind every event. See you in the next fact.